The following thrilling story is presented for your enjoyment. This classic work is now in the public domain, making it freely available to be shared and appreciated by all. Some elements may appear outdated or insensitive by today's standards, but we present this work in its original form to preserve its historical context and literary significance. Sit back, relax, and indulge in this timeless tale. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share. Every bit helps this channel grow.
Chills in the Night by Jesse Merlan from Beware, number 15, May 1953. From beyond the grave comes a chilling encounter with a dead friend. It was a cold and moonless night when Steve Hendon stepped from his train onto the deserted railroad station. Dark clouds scudded across a starless sky, and as his train gave one last mournful woo-oh-oh and slid on into the night, Steve shivered despite his warm clothing. Somehow, for the last few hours, while he'd been approaching Ferndale, he'd had a strange feeling of something wrong, of something terrible or horrible about to happen. He couldn't shake this feeling off. And it was odd that he should feel depressed or have such terribly disturbing thoughts. Ferndale was his hometown. He'd been born here, raised here, and his childhood had been quite usual and happy. His father a small grocer, his mother a happy and busy woman, and all his childhood and young manhood full of the usual play and fun. And then had come a better job in the big city, and now it had been 12 years since he'd visited Ferndale, the town of his birth. Steve stepped from the station platform carrying his bag and went down a side street, knowing exactly which shortcut to take to get him to his mother's house. This was a surprise visit. No one knew he was in town. In the last dozen years, his folks and friends had always come to the city to visit him. He'd been that busy with his career, and now at last to come home. And to have this strange feeling of dread and horror. Steve shook a shiver and chill from the base of his spine and kept walking through the dark streets. He turned from Pine Street down into Spruce, and suddenly many memories came tumbling back into his mind, chasing for a moment the strange feeling of fear that retreated within his brain. Pine and Spruce, he thought, and there's where we used to play baseball. Yes, that was the old lot, a big ball field too. And now they must have built something there because there's a big wall all around it and an iron fence, and Steve tried to see through the fence and tried to think of what might be over the wall. But the night was too black. There was no moon, and Steve tucked his Warren coat closer under his chin and kept trudging on toward home. On the next corner, a flickering streetlight almost lit up what had once been the old baseball field, and Steve thought he saw the shine of smooth marble walls, but the light was too dim for real vision. Probably built an office and factory there, he thought. And Jim Gray and I used to have such fun playing ball there. Walking along the wall and fence, every memory of Jim Gray suddenly became sharp and clear in his mind. Jim Gray. Good old Jim. His best friend, catcher on the ball team when he was pitcher, roommate at college, he'd been best man at Jim's wedding. Strange that he hadn't gotten a letter from Jim in the last month. Jim always wrote to him, always had written. Jim Gray managed the small hotel in Ferndale. Steve Hendon promised himself that he'd drop in on his mother and dad, and then call Jim on the phone, and maybe they could spend a little time together next day, reliving old memories. Jim had been such a good friend, always would be his friend. Steve spoke aloud. I wish I could see Jim now. Maybe he'd help get rid of this strange feeling I've had tonight. Yes, I wish I could see Jim. Then suddenly, from the gloom along the wall, about 50 feet ahead, a dark figure seemed to come out of the shadows and walk towards Steve. Strange that I didn't see that man before, thought Steve. I guess I've been thinking so hard about Jim that I haven't noticed things the last few seconds. Wonder who that chap is who's coming toward me. In the next 10 seconds, Steve's unspoken wondering was answered. The man's figure came closer and closer, and as it came, Steve recognized the walk, the height of the man, the shape of his face. Why, there was only one man who looked like that and walked like that. The figure was just about to walk past Steve when Steve shot out his hand and grabbed the man's coat. Jim, Steve almost shouted in surprised glee. Jim, you've answered my thoughts. Imagine meeting you walking down here by the old ball field. I was thinking about you, about us, Jim. What's the matter with you? for Jim didn't seem to share Steve Hendon's glad surprise. Strange, because Jim had always been so quick and alive and ready with words. And now it was only Steve Hendon who kept talking and pumping Jim Gray's hand and shaking Jim Gray by the elbow. "Why so quiet, Jim? Aren't you glad to see me? What are you doing out so late? Do you know it's past 2 o'clock? I just got in on the last train. How's the wife and the children? Speak up, man." Jim Gray, for a moment, seemed to want to pull away from Steve's handshake and almost encircling arm. But then Jim turned and fell into step beside Steve, and the two walked down the lightless street together. From far ahead of them, a single street lamp flared fitfully. Above them, the dark clouds scurried, and a whining wind moaned. At last, Jim Gray spoke. "I'll walk with you if you want me to so much, but I shouldn't be walking with you." Jim Gray's voice was low and soft and seemed to come from far away. Steve Hendon could just about hear him. "I've thought of you too a lot, Steve, of the good times we used to have and the good friends we always were, and then you came walking past the wall." Jim Gray's voice trailed away into a whisper, then into silence. Again that cold shiver of fear and horror that had annoyed Steve lately. That shiver came back and shook Steve's heart and soul. Was this the Jim Gray he'd known? Something was wrong here. Something. Jim Gray's soft voice began again. "Steve, I can see you don't know anything about what's happened here in Ferndale in the last 9 days. My last letter to you was written before that, and now here you come to Ferndale and you don't even know what they did with the old ball field years ago." Ball field. A choking moan seemed to close Jim Gray's throat, and again Steve shivered. Steve looked at Jim, looked at him as well as the poor light would let him. Jim Gray seemed to be thin and pale. His face was almost bloodless, and now Steve remembered that Jim's hand had been cold and icy when he grasped it. Suddenly, Steve's concern shaped hurried words on his lips. "Jim, you're not ill. You don't look well. You don't talk like yourself. Are you ill? Tell me." Jim Gray's pale face twisted slightly into a friendly smile, a sad smile. "No, Steve, I'm not ill. It would be a lot better." Jim's voice trailed into an agonized whisper. "Listen, Steve, I can't stay here. I've got to go now. But before I go, I want you to give this to Martha, my wife Martha. I know you'll be going past there before I do, much before I do. Give her this ring. Tell her I want her to keep it." And into Steve Hendon's hand, Jim Grev pressed a shiny gold ring with a small diamond set in the top of it. Steve took the ring. Steve's feelings and thoughts were all confused now. As Steve clutched the ring and as Jim released it, Steve's mind was in utter confusion. There were 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears. Why did Jim want him to take this message ring to Martha? Why wasn't Jim going back to Martha? Why was Jim so sad? Why? But before Steve could speak again, Jim Gray whispered a sad and soft, "Goodbye, Steve." And then Jim Gray walked through an open gate in the brick wall they'd been walking alongside of. And before Steve knew it, he was alone again. Steve didn't try to explain his thoughts or feelings, although he did try to guess that perhaps Jim Gray worked in the office or factory or whatever it was behind the brick wall that now encircled the old ball field. But Steve was all confused. And again, those day-long and night-long feelings of horror and fear reared themselves in his mind and soul. Squeezing the gold ring Jim had given him, Steve made a quick decision. His step now faster, he struck across an open field. This was the way to another end of town, the way to Jim Gray's house. Some horrible dread forced Steve on, faster and faster. He just had to get to Jim's house. Maybe Jim's wife Martha could explain why. Could explain everything about this weird meeting with Jim. Within 7 minutes, Steve Hendon was at Jim's house. And there was a light in the upstairs window, in the bedroom. As Steve walked up the porch steps, whoever was in that lighted room must have heard him. Because the hall and porch lights switched on, even though it was past 2 in the morning, and then Steve heard footsteps coming down the stairs. Martha Gray herself opened the door to Steve, and Steve should have realized the meaning of what his eyes saw. Because Martha was dressed all in black, dressed as a person dresses after a death in the family. His mind stunned, his terrible thoughts still unproven, Steve Hendon held out the gold and diamond ring to Martha Gray. "I met Jim down by the old ball field. He seemed to be so sad and disturbed. I don't know what's wrong, but he asked me to give you this, and he asked you to keep it forever. What does it all mean, Martha?" For an instant, Martha's eyes only widened in terror, and her mouth fell open in horror. Then she spoke in a twisted moan that rose and rose till it ended in a shriek. You met Jim by the ball field? That ball field has been a cemetery for the last 4 years. It's the town graveyard. And Jim was sick for 3 weeks, and he died 4 days ago. And we buried him there, in the graveyard. The graveyard that used to be a ball field. And I myself, I put that ring on Jim's finger just before the undertaker closed the coffin. Martha fell senseless to the floor, her eyes rolled back white with horror. The gold ring fell from Steve's hands, and then Steve Hendon knew the meaning of the word.
Fear.